before the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, before America even knew it was at war, Japan had already made the decision that would seal its fate. On the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, the Pacific looked calm, almost peaceful, as American sailors prepared for another routine day in Hawaii. Battleships sat motionless in the harbor, their steel hulls reflecting the soft glow of the rising sun. Men joked, shaved, wrote letters home, completely unaware that hundreds of miles away, Japanese pilots were gripping their controls, engines roaring, hearts pounding, flying straight toward history. Then the sky exploded. The first bombs fell with a sound survivors would later describe as the tearing of the world itself. Fire erupted across the harbor as torpedoes slammed into ships that had no chance to maneuver. The USS Arizona vanished in a single catastrophic blast, killing more than 1,000 men in seconds. Oil burned on the water's surface, trapping sailors who clawed desperately for air. Screams mixed with sirens, gunfire, and the thunder of collapsing steel. In less than 2 hours, the United States Navy lay shattered. Japan had delivered one of the most devastating surprise attacks in military history. From Tokyo, it looked like a flawless victory. America's Pacific Fleet was crippled. The road to Japanese dominance in Asia seemed wide open. But beneath the smoke and wreckage, something far more dangerous had been awakened. Japan believed Pearl Harbor would break America's will to fight. Instead, it ignited a fire that would burn until Tokyo itself lay in ruins. To understand Japan's greatest mistake, you have to understand the mindset behind the attack. By 1941, Japan was already deep into a brutal war in China. Its leaders believed expansion was not a choice but a necessity. Japan lacked oil, steel, and raw materials, and American sanctions threatened to strangle its economy. The United States demanded Japan withdraw from China. Japan's military leaders saw that as national humiliation. So, they chose war. The plan was bold, even brilliant on paper. Destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one devastating strike. Buy time to conquer Southeast Asia. Fortify a massive defensive perimeter. When America finally counterattacked, Japan believed U.S. losses would be so horrific that Washington would negotiate peace. It was a gamble built on one fatal assumption, that America would lose the will to fight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, feared this assumption. He had studied in the United States. He understood American industry, American pride, and American anger. He famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but beyond that, he had no confidence. Yamamoto was right. In the days after Pearl Harbor, America did not collapse. It unified. Factories shifted overnight from cars to tanks, from appliances to bombers. Men lined up to enlist. Women filled assembly lines. The attack that was meant to paralyze the United States instead turned it into a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Japan had struck hard, but it had missed something crucial. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. Those carriers would soon change everything. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan surged across the Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed in a stunning British defeat. The Philippines were overrun, forcing American and Filipino troops into the deadly Bataan Death March. Japanese forces appeared unstoppable, their victories reinforcing the belief that Pearl Harbor had worked exactly as planned. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Japan's empire was vast but fragile. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Its industrial capacity could not match America's. Most dangerously, Japan's leadership began to believe its own myth of invincibility. That belief led them straight into their second and even more catastrophic mistake. In June 1942, Japan set its sights on Midway Island, a tiny outpost northwest of Hawaii. Japanese planners believed capturing Midway would lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Destroy them, and the Pacific would belong to Japan. What they didn't know was that American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the attack was coming. He knew the timing. He knew the targets. And he prepared a trap. As Japanese carriers approached Midway, confident and aggressive, American carriers waited in silence. The battle that followed would become one of the most dramatic turning points in military history. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese planes launched from the carriers to bomb Midway. The attack caused damage, but it failed to neutralize the island. As planes returned to their carriers, Japanese decks filled with fueled aircraft, bombs, and torpedoes. Crews raced to rearm for a second strike, unaware that American dive bombers were already in the air. Then, in a matter of minutes, everything collapsed. American planes appeared out of the clouds, diving almost vertically toward the Japanese fleet. Bombs smashed into carriers packed with fuel and explosives. Firestorms erupted instantly. One by one, Japan's finest carriers were transformed into floating INFERNOS.AKAGI.KAGA.SOYU.HIRYU. The carriers lost in a single day. Thousands of Japan's best pilots and crew killed. The heart of Japan's naval air power was destroyed almost instantly. Midway was not just a defeat. It was a shock wave. Japan could replace ships. It could not replace experience. The pilots lost at Midway represented years of training and combat skill. From that moment on, Japan would be fighting a war it could no longer win. Still, the war dragged on and Japan doubled down on its original mistake, underestimating America's endurance. As the United States launched its island-hopping campaign, Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical determination. On Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, American troops encountered a new kind of warfare: jungle ambushes, night attacks, soldiers who refused to surrender, even when wounded or surrounded. The battlefield atmosphere was nightmarish. Thick humidity clung to the skin. The air buzzed with insects and gunfire. Marines slept in foxholes, listening to whispers in the darkness, never knowing when the next attack would come. Every island became a miniature apocalypse, paid for in blood. Japan believed these horrific battles would convince America that the cost was too high. Instead, they hardened American resolve. With every island captured, U.S. bombers moved closer to Japan itself. By 1944, American B-29s were taking off from newly captured airfields, heading straight for the Japanese home islands. Night after night, cities burned. Tokyo was engulfed in firestorms that killed more civilians than either atomic bomb would later claim. Wooden neighborhoods vanished in walls of flame. Families fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Children cried as the sky turned red. Yet Japan's leadership still refused to surrender. Even as its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific and its air force was reduced to desperate kamikaze attacks, Japan clung to the belief that America would eventually negotiate. Kamikaze pilots climbed into their planes knowing they would not return. Many were barely out of school. They wrote farewell letters, drank ceremonial cups of sake, and took off toward American fleets with a single mission: to die. Their sacrifice was meant to shock America into submission. It didn't. By 1945, the war had become a grim countdown. American planners prepared for an invasion of Japan itself, an operation expected to kill millions on both sides. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa offered a terrifying preview of what that invasion would look like. Entire landscapes were reduced to rubble. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, coerced or terrified into suicide by Japanese propaganda. Japan's original gamble had failed completely. The United States had not broken. It had grown stronger with every blow. Then came the final consequence of Japan's mistake. In August 1945, a single American bomber flew over Hiroshima. One bomb fell. In an instant, a city disappeared. Tens of thousands were vaporized. Survivors wandered through ruins, burned and blinded, calling out for loved ones who would never answer. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Only then did Japan surrender. The war that began with a surprise attack meant to secure Japan's future ended with the near destruction of the nation itself. Japan's biggest mistake in World War II was not just Pearl Harbor. It was the belief that fear could defeat resolve, that shock could replace strategy, and that America would choose comfort over sacrifice. That belief underestimated not just American industry or military power, but the human will to endure. Pearl Harbor awakened a sleeping giant, just as Yamamoto feared. And once awakened, that giant could not be stopped. The Pacific War stands as a brutal reminder that victories built on arrogance and miscalculation often carry the seeds of total defeat. Japan struck first, struck hard, and struck brilliantly. But in doing so, it set in motion a chain of events that would consume its empire, its cities, and an entire generation in the end. The greatest tragedy is not just how the war was fought, but how avoidable its final outcome truly was.